Chapter 5. The Homecoming. Dr. David Blythe had sent his horse and buggy to meet them, and the urchin who had brought it slipped away with a sympathetic grin, leaving them to the delight of driving alone to their new home through the radiant evening. Anne never forgot the loveliness of the view that broke upon them when they had driven over the hill behind the village. Her new home could not yet be seen, but before her lay Four Winds Harbor, like a great shining mirror of rose and silver. Far down she saw its entrance between the bar of sand dunes on one side and a steep, high, grim, red sandstone cliff on the other. Beyond the bar, the sea, calm and austere, dreamed in the afterlight. The little fishing village, nestled in the cove where the sand dunes met the harbor shore, looked like a great opal in the haze. The sky over them was like a jeweled cup from which the dusk was pouring. The air was crisp with the compelling tang of the sea, and the whole landscape was infused with the subtleties of the sea evening. A few dim sails drifted along the darkening fir-clad harbor shores. A bell was ringing from the tower of a little white church on the far side. Mellowly and dreamily sweet, the chime floated across the water, blent with the moan of the sea. The great revolving light on the cliff at the channel flashed warm and golden against the clear northern sky, a trembling, quivering star of good hope. Far out along the horizon was the crinkled gray ribbon of a passing steamer's smoke. "Oh, beautiful, beautiful," murmured Anne. "I shall love Four Winds, Gilbert. Where's our house?" "We can't see it yet. The belt of birch running up from that little cove hides it. It's about 2 miles from Glen St. Mary, and there's another mile between it and the lighthouse. We won't have many neighbors, Anne. There's only one house near us, and I don't know who lives in it. Shall you be lonely when I'm away?" "Not with that light and that loveliness for company. Who lives in that house, Gilbert?" "I don't know. It doesn't look exactly as if the occupants would be kindred spirits, Anne, does it?" The house was a large, substantial affair, painted such a vivid green that the landscape seemed quite faded by contrast. There was an orchard behind it, and a nicely kept lawn before it, but somehow there was a certain bareness about it. Perhaps its neatness was responsible for this. The whole establishment, house, barns, orchard, garden, lawn, and lane, was so starkly neat. "It doesn't seem probable that anyone with that taste in paint could be very kindred," acknowledged Anne, "unless it were an accident, like our blue hall. I feel certain there are no children there, at least. It's even neater than the old cop place on Tory Road, and I never expected to see anything neater than that." They had not met anybody on the moist red road that wound along the harbor shore, but just before they came to the belt of birch which hid their home, Anne saw a girl who was driving a flock of snow-white geese along the crest of a velvety green hill on the right. Great scattered firs grew along it. Between their trunks, one saw glimpses of yellow harvest fields, gleams of golden sandhills, and bits of blue sea. The girl was tall and wore a dress of pale blue print. She walked with a certain springiness of step and erectness of bearing. She and her geese came out of the gate at the foot of the hill as Anne and Gilbert passed. She stood with her hand on the fastening of the gate and looked steadily at them with an expression that hardly attained to interest, but did not descend to curiosity. It seemed to Anne, for a fleeting moment, that there was even a veiled hint of hostility in it. But it was the girl's beauty which made Anne give a little gasp, a beauty so marked that it must have attracted attention anywhere. She was hatless, but heavy braids of burnished hair, the hue of ripe wheat, were twisted upon her head like a coronet. Her eyes were blue and star-like. Her figure, in its plain print gown, was magnificent, and her lips were as crimson as the bunch of blood-red poppies she wore at her belt. "Gilbert, who is the girl we've just passed?" asked Anne in a low voice. "I didn't notice any girl," said Gilbert, who had eyes only for his bride. "She was standing by that gate. No, don't look back. She's still watching us. I never saw such a beautiful face." "I don't remember seeing any very handsome girls while I was here. There are some pretty girls up at the Glen, but I hardly think they would be called beautiful." "This girl is. You can't have seen her or you would have remembered her." "Nobody could forget her. I never saw such a face except in pictures. And her hair, it made me think of Browning's Cord of Gold and Gorgeous Snake." "Probably she's some visitor in Four Winds, likely someone from that big summer hotel over the harbor. She wore a white apron and she was driving geese. She might do that for amusement. Look, Anne, there's our house." Anne looked and forgot for a time the girl with the splendid, resentful eyes. The first glimpse of her new home was a delight to eye and spirit. It looked so like a big, creamy seashell stranded on the harbor shore. The rows of tall Lombardy poplars down its lane stood out in stately purple silhouette against the sky. Behind it, sheltering its garden from the too keen breath of sea winds, was a cloudy fir wood in which the winds might make all kinds of weird and haunting music. Like all woods, it seemed to be holding and unfolding secrets in its recesses. secrets whose charm is only to be won by entering in and patiently seeking. Outwardly, dark green arms kept them inviolate from curious or indifferent eyes. The night winds were beginning their wild dances beyond the bar, and the fishing hamlet across the harbor was gemmed with lights as Anne and Gilbert drove up the poplar lane. The door of the little house opened, and a warm glow of firelight flickered out into the dusk. Gilbert lifted Anne from the buggy and led her into the garden. Through the little gate between the ruddy-tipped firs, up the trim, red path to the sandstone steps. "Welcome home," he whispered, and in hand they stepped over the threshold of their house of dreams. Chapter 6. Captain Jim. Old Dr. Dave and Mrs. Dr. Dave had come down to the little house to greet the bride and groom. Dr. Dave was a big, jolly, white-whiskered, silver-haired old fellow, and Mrs. Doctor was a trim, rosy-cheeked, silver-haired little lady who took Anne at once to her heart, literally and figuratively. "I'm so glad to see you, dear. You must be real tired. We've got a bite of supper ready, and Captain Jim brought up some trout for you. Captain Jim, where are you? Oh, he slipped out to see to the horse, I suppose. Come upstairs and take your things off." Anne looked about her with bright, appreciative eyes as she followed Mrs. Dr. Dave upstairs. She liked the appearance of her new home very much. It seemed to have the atmosphere of Green Gables and the flavor of her old traditions. "I think I would have found Miss Elizabeth Russell a kindred spirit," she murmured when she was alone in her room. There were 2 windows in it. The dormer one looked out onto the lower harbor and the sandbar and the Four Winds light. "A magic casement opening on the foam of perilous seas and fairylands forlorn," quoted Anne softly. The gable window gave a view of a little harvest-hued valley through which a brook ran. Half a mile up the brook was the only house in sight, an old rambling gray one surrounded by huge willows through which its windows peered, like shy, seeking eyes into the dusk. Anne wondered who lived there. They would be her nearest neighbors, and she hoped they would be nice. She suddenly found herself thinking of the beautiful girl with the white geese. "Gilbert thought she didn't belong here," mused Anne, "but I feel sure she does. There was something about her that made her part of the sea and the sky and the harbor. Four Winds is in her blood." When Anne went downstairs, Gilbert was standing before the fireplace talking to a stranger. Both turned as Anne entered. "Anne, this is Captain Boyd. Captain Boyd, my wife." It was the first time Gilbert had said "my wife" to anybody but Anne, and he narrowly escaped bursting with the pride of it. The old captain held out a sinewy hand to Anne. They smiled at each other and were friends from that moment. Kindred spirit flashed recognition to kindred spirit. I'm right down pleased to meet you, Mistressblythe, and I hope you'll be as happy as the first bride who came here." "I can't wish you no better than that, but your husband doesn't introduce me just exactly right. Captain Jim is my week-a-day name, and you might as well begin as you're starting to end up calling me that. You certainly are a nice little bride, Mistressblythe. Looking at you sorta makes me feel that I've just been married myself." Amid the laughter that followed, Mrs. Dr. Dave urged Captain Jim to stay and have supper with them. "Thank you kindly. 'Twill be a real treat, Mistress Doctor. I mostly has to eat my meals alone with the reflection of my ugly old phiz in a looking-glass opposite for company. 'Tisn't often I have a chance to sit down with 2 such sweet, pretty ladies." Captain Jim's compliments may look very bald on paper, but he paid them with such a gracious, gentle deference of tone and look that the woman upon whom they were bestowed felt that she was being offered a queen's tribute in kingly fashion. Captain Jim was a high-souled, simple-minded old man with eternal youth in his eyes and heart. He had a tall, rather ungainly figure, somewhat stooped, yet suggestive of great strength and endurance, a clean-shaven face deeply lined and bronzed, a thick mane of iron-gray hair falling quite to his shoulders, and a pair of remarkably blue, deep-set eyes which sometimes twinkled and sometimes dreamed, and sometimes looked out seaward with a wistful quest in them, as of one seeking something precious and lost. Anne was to learn one day what it was for which Captain Jim looked. It could not be denied that Captain Jim was a homely man. His spare jaws, rugged mouth, and square brow were not fashioned on the lines of beauty, and he had passed through many hardships and sorrows which had marked his body as well as his soul. But though at first sight Anne thought him plain, she never thought anything more of it. The spirit shining through that rugged tenement beautified it so wholly. They gathered gaily around the supper table. The hearth fire banished the chill of the September evening, but the window of the dining room was open, and sea breezes entered at their own sweet will. The view was magnificent, taking in the harbor and the sweep of low purple hills beyond. The table was heaped with Mrs. Doctor's delicacies, but the pièce de résistance was undoubtedly the big platter of sea trout. "Thought they'd be sort of tasty after traveling," said Captain Jim. "They're fresh as trout can be, Mistressblythe. 2 hours ago they were swimming in the Glen Pond." Who was attending to the light tonight, Captain Jim? Asked Dr. Dave. Nephew Alec. He understands as well as I do. Well, now, I'm real glad you asked me to stay to supper. I'm proper hungry. Didn't have much of a dinner today. I believe you half-starve yourself most of the time down at that light, said Mrs. Dr. Dave severely. You won't take the trouble to get up a decent meal. Oh, I do, Mistress Doctor, I do, protested Captain Jim. Why, I live like a king generally. Last night I was up to the Glen and took home 2 pounds of steak. I meant to have a spanking good dinner today. And what happened to the steak? Asked Mrs. Dr. Dave. Did you lose it on the way home? No, Captain Jim looked sheepish. Just at bedtime, a poor ornery sort of dog came along and asked for a night's lodging. Guess he belonged to some of the fishermen longshore. I couldn't turn the poor cur out. He had a sore foot, so I shut him in the porch with an old bag to lie on and went to bed. But somehow I couldn't sleep. Come to think it over, I sort of remember that dog looked hungry. And you got up and gave him that steak. All that steak, said Mrs. Dr. Dave with a kind of triumphant reproof. Well, there wasn't anything else to give him, said Captain Jim depreciatingly. Nothing a dog would care for, that is. I reckon he was hungry, for he made about 2 bites of it. I had a fine sleep the rest of the night, but my dinner had to be sort of scanty. Potatoes and point, as you might say. The dog, he lit out for home this morning. I reckon he weren't a vegetarian. The idea of starving yourself for a worthless dog, sniffed Mrs. Doctor. You don't know, but he may be worth a lot to somebody, protested Captain Jim. He didn't look of much account, but you can't go by looks and judging. Like myself, he might be a real beauty inside. The first mate didn't approve of him, I'll allow. His language was right down forcible. But the first mate is prejudiced. No use in taking a cat's opinion of a dog. At any rate, I lost my meal, so this nice spread in this delightful company is real pleasant. It's a great thing to have good neighbors. Who lives in the house among the willows up the brook? Asked Anne. Mrs. Dick Moore, said Captain Jim, and her husband, he added, as if by way of an afterthought. Anne smiled and deduced a mental picture of Mrs. Dick Moore from Captain Jim's way of putting it, evidently a second Mrs. Rachel Lynde. You haven't many neighbors, Mistressblythe, Captain Jim went on. This side of the harbor is mighty thinly settled. Most of the land belongs to Mr. Howard up yonder past the glen, and he rents it out for pasture. The other side of the harbor now is thick with folks, especially McAllisters. There's a whole colony of McAllisters. You can throw a stone, but you hit one. I was talking to old Leon Blackery the other day. He's been working on the harbor all summer. They're nearly all McAllisters over there, he told me. There's Neil McAllister and Sandy McAllister and William McAllister and Alec McAllister and Angus McAllister, and I believe there's the Devil McAllister. There are nearly as many Elliots and Crawfords, said Dr. Dave after the laughter had subsided. You know, Gilbert, we folk on this side of Four Winds have an old saying. From the conceit of the Elliots, the pride of the McAllisters, and the vain glory of the Crawfords, good Lord deliver us. There's a plenty of fine people among them, though, said Captain Jim. I sailed with William Crawford for many a year, and for courage and endurance and truth that man hadn't an equal. They've got brains over on that side of Four Winds. Maybe that's why this side is sort of inclined to pick on 'em. Strange, ain't it? How folks seem to resent anyone being born a mite cleverer than they be. Dr. Dave, who had 40 years' feud with the over-harbor people, laughed and subsided. Who lives in that brilliant emerald house about half a mile up the road? Asked Gilbert. Captain Jim smiled delightedly. Miss Cornelia Bryant. She'll likely be over to see you soon, seeing you're Presbyterians. If you were Methodist, she wouldn't come at all. Cornelia has a holy horror of Methodists. She's quite a character, chuckled Dr. Dave. A most inveterate man-hater. Sour grapes? Queried Gilbert, laughing. No, 'tisn't sour grapes, answered Captain Jim seriously. Cornelia could have had her pick when she was young. Even yet, she's only to say the word to see the old widowers jump. She just seems to have been born with a sort of chronic spite against men and Methodists. She's got the bitterest tongue and the kindest heart in Four Winds. Wherever there's any trouble, that woman is there, doing everything to help in the tenderest way. She never says a harsh word about another woman. And if she likes to cart us poor scalawags of men down, I reckon our tough old hides can stand it. She always speaks well of you, Captain Jim, said Mrs. Doctor. Yes, I'm afraid so. I don't half like it. It makes me feel as if there must be something sort of unnatural about me.